right, it is noon, so thanks everybody for joining us. Nat, are we live on Facebook?
You are live on Facebook, yes.
Fantastic. So I see we've got quite a few people that have joined us. Hopefully we've got people on Facebook joining us too. Welcome everybody. I'm Britin Bostick. I'm the Downtown and Historic Planner for the City of Georgetown. And returning with me, we have Ann Evans, Reference Librarian for the Georgetown Public Library, the award-winning Georgetown Public Library for good reason. So to give you a little background, if you're not familiar with this presentation, we started this back in May in order to celebrate Preservation Month. So every May, we celebrate Historic Preservation Month along with a lot of cities across the US. And we do that because our historic resources are so important to us, both locally, statewide, and nationally. And so we did 4 presentations. Those are posted on the website. You can link to those at historic.georgetown.org. If you want to see the previous videos from May, and join me for the last video in May that we did, the last webinar. And Ann is joining me again. We're coming back with a continuation of the series. We're calling it Tuesday Talks with Britin and Ann because we'll be live on Tuesdays, the first Tuesday of the month at noon. So if you need the information or the link to that, you can go to the front page of historic.georgetown.org and do that. And we're also able to stream these on the City of Georgetown's Facebook, and also hopefully our downtown Facebook feed is live too. So a lot of different ways to watch. And then when we're able to get these videos posted, you'll be able to recap those online or share them with your friends. We'll get them posted to that same historic.georgetown.org. So today, we really wanted to take you on a road trip of sorts. We're all stuck at home right now. A lot of us are, a lot of people are sort of back to work, but we're still trying to be very careful. And so in lieu of doing in-person presentations on Georgetown's history and on our historic buildings, we wanted to take this opportunity to do this virtually and take you on what I'm going to call a virtual road trip, specifically because we weren't sure how many people knew what the impact of I-35 was to our downtown and to our community as a whole. And so Ann's got some great information she's going to share, and we're going to talk through a little more about how we got the downtown that we have today. So Ann, tell me about this newspaper article. This is from, it looks like 1963, and
January.
We're talking about a crystal ball of sorts. So what is this about?
Yes, exactly. The crystal ball was very accurate. So this is January 1963. This is when construction is starting on I-35 through this area, and it's predicting that major growth is going to occur. And of course, we know that to be true. We've all witnessed it, whether you've been here 1 year or 40 years, you have seen how I-35 has completely changed the landscape of Central Texas, including Georgetown. One thing I kind of wanted to note is it's interesting, it wasn't as immediate as the paper thought it would be. It didn't quite take off in the same way in the 60s, but starting in the 70s and then especially into the 80s, 90s, and of course the 2000s, there's exponential growth.
Absolutely. And so to give you an idea of numbers, if you're new to Georgetown, you're used to Georgetown today, which is around 80,000 people. But the time period that we're talking about, according to the 1960 census, there were only 5,218 people living in Georgetown. By 1970, it was 6,395 people. But by 1980, it was 9,468 people, and by 1990, 14,842. Quick plug, if you haven't filled out your census yet, please do that, census.gov. We want to make sure that everybody in Georgetown is counted so that when historians in the future look back at what was Georgetown like in 2020, they can get an accurate population count. So quick plug for that. The city's been doing a lot of outreach, making sure that everybody gets counted, and we'd love for you to be counted in that as well. And this is one of the reasons why, so that I can go back to see how many people were here in 1960. So around this time, we're looking at about 5,300 people in Georgetown. It was much smaller than it is today. And to give y'all a picture, a literal picture of I-35 being constructed, This is from October 22nd, 1964. This is an aerial photo of the city of Georgetown that I get to use a lot in my research and when I'm presenting applications to our historic commission. And so this is I-35 under construction, that big, very light colored strip that you see that has a bit of a curve to it. That is all the dirt being moved around in order to construct 35. So there are some bridges that had already, the better part of the bridges had been constructed over the North and South San Gabriel River branches. But this is Georgetown, and this is really what we're looking at. This is the extent of Georgetown. And you can see that there was a lot of farmland very close around what we identify today as our downtown and Old Town historic districts.
And I just want to point out, look how bare the west side of I-35 is.
Yes. So, and we're going to point to this a little bit more, but it looks like we've got what looks like pretty healthy farmland. It's a black and white photo, so a little hard to tell, but pretty healthy farmland on the right side or on the east side of town, but it looks completely different on the west side. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I-35, to some degree, roughly follows the Balcones Escarpment, which is a divide in the regions kind of Texas. So on the west side, you have the Edwards Plateau, which is limestone. That's why you can't dig down far. If you live on the west side, you immediately hit bedrock. On the right side is the Blackland Prairie. So that's where crops are grown. Much loamier soil. You can dig down farther. It makes construction harder. That's why you have more pier and beam households, especially out further east in Taylor, because you're not building right on top of that bedrock. So it's very different. You have a lot of ranching happening on the west side, more farming happening on the east side. And that's, again, roughly kind of that division is I-35.
So that's really interesting. Let's zoom in a little bit on this photo because we're taking this from pretty high up. So before I-35, you went through the middle of town on what we know today as Austin Avenue. It used to be called Brushy Street. So a lot of times in the old maps, you'll see Brushy Street. That's what we know as Austin Avenue. And that was how you got through town before I-35 was constructed. I want to zoom around the map a little bit just to highlight some fun things. So if you live off Williams Drive, or if you use Williams Drive to get to your home or your place of business or your favorite restaurant, the yellow arrow is pointing to Williams Drive in 1964. And so you can see it's very different than the way that we know it today. There were just a few houses, just a few little bits of neighborhood, and that was really the outskirts of Georgetown at the time. And then right there where you see I-35 and Austin Avenue get really close together, that's where the Williams Drive Bridge is. A lot of us use that every day to get to and from home, work, school, maybe. And so then you can see the Austin Avenue bridges over the San Gabriel River there. But again, that was Georgetown. That was the extent of Georgetown, which is kind of wild to us today. This part of the map, I'm zooming in on State Highway 29. Also, we call it University Avenue and I-35. This really looks different today. We'll go through a little bit of the development that's happened there, but I've got a yellow arrow pointing to where you used to have to cross the river around 10th Street because that bridge that you cross over as you're going, let's say from downtown toward the highway or toward HEB, that bridge was not there originally. That bridge was actually kind of not super new, but newer construction. And so you had to take your horses and your wagons and kind of ford the river at a lower crossing back before we had that highway bridge built to get traffic more safely across and more easily across. The cars, the automobiles weren't very able to navigate the river like horses could. And so things have really changed over time as we've had to build bridges for crossings and highways in many ways around Georgetown. So I thought that was kind of a fun note. If you didn't know, that's where you used to have to cross the river to get to the west side. And this is what we know today as Leander Road. And so you can see this is very, very rural. This is through what Anna just described as better suited for ranch lands. This is has a lot of limestone that crops up or is very, very shallow soil. And you can see it even kind of looks drier And then you've got those cedar trees, some oak trees that you can see scattered around. So Leander Road was the road to Leander, and it didn't have very much development and none of the neighborhoods that you might be familiar with today along Leander Road. And so to zoom in a little bit more, we wanted to point this out because this is one of the kind of most extreme examples of the impacts of I-35. The arrow is pointing to a site that many of you might be familiar with. It's called the Page House. And this is the Page Weir Crow House. It's listed with the state of Texas as an important historic site. Locally, it's an important historic site. And so right now we know it to be close to I-35. It's right off of Leander Road. But when I-35 was constructed, and you can see this horizontal line extending from the house, I-35 cut right through the road up to the front of their house. But it did some other things, Anne, and you have some information on how impactful that was to,
Yes.
To this family.
So in particular, the Weirs operated a polo field. And Georgetown kind of became known in Central Texas for polo matches and polo fields happening at the Page House grounds. And I-35 completely destroyed the polo field, which in the scope of things is much better than what it did to some other towns. Round Rock, for instance, Old Settlers Park had to be completely relocated. Several churches had to be relocated and moved. So it could have just devastated our downtown, but it didn't. We only lost our polo field.
And so from what I understand, it was in some places, highways have been going through the center of town since we really had highways in towns to go through them. And so Georgetown, the center of traffic was our downtown. That was where all the commerce went through. That's where the rail line ended up coming into. But when we built the interstate highway system, particularly I-35, Georgetown advocated for our highway to not go through the middle of our downtown. In fact, the residents, I believe, wanted it to kind of skirt around town so that none of those buildings had to be moved. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
So yes, there were actually businessmen that wanted it to go west of downtown, which is why you see that kind of bow happening. It doesn't go straight along Highway 81, which would have been straight down Austin Avenue. But they knew that that would eventually impact businesses, that it would eventually take over the downtown if that's the route it took. So there were a lot of advocates to have it skirt. And actually, for a town of Georgetown size, which again was only about 5,000 people at the time, the fact that they were able to reroute the highway west of town was a big accomplishment. It kind of meant some friends in higher places sort of thing to help it go that way. And it went through primarily ranch land, which people were more than willing to sell, because at that time, through the 1950s, there had been terrible droughts. And it broke with a horrible flood in the 1957 flood. That gave us a lot of the dams and river infrastructure that we have today. So the ranchers were more than willing to sell over there, whereas downtown businessmen were not as willing to sell.
That's really interesting. So it sounds like, and if you've been in Central Texas very long, we had a pretty significant drought from 2011 to 2015. And that was one of the more significant droughts we had ever had since the 1950s. But back in the 1950s, Texas experienced pretty extreme drought conditions. And so, you know, this ranch land that had been, I think, really profitable in Williamson County has had a cattle industry. Georgetown's been part of that. We can see that in old photos, which we'll show in just a minute a little bit of. But so putting an interstate highway so close to somebody's house just seems really impossible. But it sounds like financially they felt like that was the best move for them to go ahead and get payment for the land that they were giving up for that interstate highway compared to the land, you know, the revenue that they may have lost because of it's really hard to raise cattle in drought conditions. And it sounds like that was something that they were kind of more on board with than we might have expected.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so let's take a step back. Our road trip is a little bit more of a road trip through time rather than a road trip through Texas. But highways, when we think of highways, I think it's really important to understand we're really going back to a time that people were traveling by horse, by wagon, and on foot. And so we're not really sure where this picture comes from. It is in the Georgetown collection. I would like to think that this is either located very near to Georgetown or part of Georgetown, but I don't have a date for this either. But what we do know is that this is what you could expect if you were traveling highways in the 1800s. You could expect kind of sparse populations. You could expect dirt roads. They would get muddy when it rained. They would have ruts in them. People moved livestock along them. They walked along them. They rode horses along them. And so a lot of towns in Texas you'll see are about 30 miles apart, more or less. And that would have been about a day's travel to get from town to town to town. And so that's why we end up developing kind of the way that we did. In Georgetown, though Georgetown at this time, if we go back into the 1800s, Georgetown was the county seat of Williamson County, kind of from the very beginning. But Georgetown was not necessarily the most prominent town. And Ann, I understand from you that Taylor actually had for quite some time more prominence. They were located on a rail line. And so I-35 was even initially expected to go through Taylor rather than through Georgetown.
Yes, so there were some debates on what route I-35 would take exactly, whether it would go through Taylor or whether it would go through Georgetown. And just kind of touch back though on what you're talking about with the roads. It's important to note it didn't change when cars came about. So the roads weren't suddenly paved magically. The cars were dealing with these roads well into downtown Georgetown wasn't paved until the 1920s.
Oh, wow.
And parts of Georgetown, like San Jose, for instance, weren't even paved until the 40s or 50s. So just right across the university from downtown was still dirt roads for quite a while until really recently. So for instance, a group of men left in the 19-teens to go from Granger to Plainview, which today would take us about 6 hours. It took them 4 days.
Wow. And
they had to travel along the railroad line so that they could hitch a ride on a train if they broke down. So it's really important, like we think, okay, well, horses and buggies and people walking, that's one way to picture it. But then once we start thinking of cars, we automatically think of paved roads, but that is definitely not the case.
But that's not how we started. We had to drive around on dirt roads with our fancy new automobiles for a while.
Yes, absolutely.
So this photo is from around 1880. And so what we're showing here is, this is a photo, looks like it was taken from the Williamson County Courthouse. Not the same courthouse that we had today because that wasn't built until 1910. But the reason we know it was probably taken from the courthouse is because the height and where it's looking. So this is where you can see saloon in big letters. That is the west side of the Georgetown Square. So this is our downtown. Right behind that, you can see the beginnings of where they constructed lumber yards and depots around where the rail line came in. And then behind that, you can see a community that we now call today our Track Ridge Grasshopper neighborhood. So primarily the African-American community in Georgetown. But again, Georgetown at this time is really small. So I looked further back in the census records. In 1870, Georgetown only had 479 people. By 1880, it had 1,354 people. By 1890, about 2,500 people. And then by 1900, just 2,800 people. So Georgetown was really, for our terms today, Georgetown was really small. It was a small town. However, it was bustling, it was busy, and we can see some of the businesses on these buildings. You can see a saloon, we can see dry goods and boots. I like that we can see boots painted on the side of the building. That's really fun. These buildings were what we built when we were using mostly local materials before the railroads were bringing in kind of a finer quality of lumber, other kind of fancy building materials. And what's important about that is that we were not really able to carry in sophisticated products and building materials very well before the railroad came in. And so even if we had roads, they weren't nearly what we have in terms of highway today. So getting goods to Georgetown was just really difficult. It was very laborious, and things were carried up on ox cart from Houston. And then we got the railroad. We were able to get access to better building materials but those really weren't able to come very well over land, especially you're thinking these like really long pieces of lumber and larger building materials. And so all the buildings that you see in this photo ended up getting replaced with larger, newer, taller, fancier buildings once we were able to get access to those resources. So here is the side of the west side of the square that we're more used to today that replaced the buildings that you just saw. And these are the buildings that we're more familiar with. Although you can see in this photo, at this time we were still driving wagons around drawn by horses and mules. But you can see these dirt roads that we had to contend with back in the day in our downtown.
And it's also, that is a First Monday photo. So that was when everyone came to town. So this is a busy downtown for that time period.
So First Mondays, remind us, Ann, for everybody who didn't join us in May, what was First Monday and what did they do on those
Kind
days?
of like a big farmer's market. Everybody brought their goods to town. People might bring things that needed to be ginned because they knew that there were going to be fresh supplies in the store. So everybody would kind of get their shopping done. All the farmers are coming in downtown. So it's going to be a bustling, busy day for downtown. So circa 1915, this would have been a busy downtown.
Oh, fun. And then our beautiful buildings that we appreciate people taking such good care of, we can still have them today. So this photo, we're moving a little bit later on in time. Now we're seeing the cars. This is such a great photo, seeing the cars parked along. This is Austin Avenue. So we're still staying on, this is the main highway through town. This is, if you were traveling through Georgetown, you went right through our square. But this is in the block. You can see the Palace Theater on the left. The marquee is a little bit blurry. And then I've got a blue arrow pointing to a store that is that has got a sign out front, Piggly Wiggly. So some of you may be familiar with the Piggly Wiggly supermarkets. You see them more in the southeastern United States now, but Piggly Wiggly was really popular in Texas for quite some time. I believe they got started around 1917. And so this was taken around 1930, and so Piggly Wiggly had already been established, and we did have a Piggly Wiggly grocery store in our downtown, and this story continues. So this is a building that y'all would probably know better today as Wildfire Restaurant. That used to be the Piggly Wiggly store there next to the Palace Theater. And then this is still on Austin Avenue, and so we can see the building there on the right is the Stromberg Hoffman building. And so today we know it is Barrels and Amps. Also TrueCore Fitness is there on the second floor. And so really different. One of the things that is very different from today is that you don't see any trees in our downtown. That didn't come until much later. And so most of these older pictures, you'll see streets, you'll see sidewalks, you'll see buildings, people, and vehicles, but you won't really see any trees. Part of that is because Georgetown didn't start out with a lot of trees. These have all, the trees that we enjoy in our historic districts have really come about because people planted them over time, or in some cases, if your squirrels are as busy as mine, the squirrels have been busy planting oak and pecan trees over the last several decades. But we can see a cafe in the background. We can see a lot of business activity. And so this was Georgetown. And so there weren't kind of separate commercial areas. There was just the one commercial area here in the center. And that's one of the reasons that we get such great buildings. I do want to point out on the left of this photo, it's a little bit shadowy and kind of difficult to see, but that is a hotel building that figures into our road trip pretty importantly. You have to make stops as you're road tripping sometimes, and so we have a hotel story that we're going to bring to you also. This is a photo, thanks to Special Collections of Southwestern University for sharing this with me. This is a photo that is looking toward our courthouse. You can see it in the background, looking toward the north, and the large building that you see in the foreground is no longer there. So if you're kind of looking for reference points, trying to figure out where we are, the first street that's horizontal in front of you, that's University Avenue or Highway 29. And then I've highlighted Austin Avenue. The other street that it's extending up is Main Street. The building right there is the Georgetown School, which is no longer there. The Dos Salsas, the oil exchange, and then also Wells Fargo are now on that block. The Austin Avenue and Main Street, these are still really important streets, but kind of small in scale, a good scale to fit the community. But there was kind of this idea when I-35 was proposed, and that would have used both of these streets for that highway traffic in a way that makes me shudder a little bit when we talk about it today.
So again, when you're going back to that push and pull between those people who wanted to get it to go through downtown and people who wanted it to skirt town, there was actually a proposal at one point in time that would have had northbound traffic going up Main Street on the interstate and southbound traffic coming down Austin Avenue. So it would go on either side of the courthouse, was the thought process.
Wow.
Which is, yeah, it makes you shudder a little bit to think about, especially when you think about the scale of it now. And that's kind of was the counterpoint that people made is, have you seen a highway? To some of these suggestions. Because it wasn't something people really knew. People couldn't have in their minds the scale of roadway that we were talking about with the construction of I-35. That wasn't common in this area at that time. It was something going to be completely new. So some of the men who had been to World War II in particular and seen like the Autobahn in Germany, that kind of understood where the federal highway acts were coming from, had a better sense of what this was going to be. But if you were just an ordinary citizen, it wasn't something that you could necessarily wrap your head around the scale of.
Well, and now that we've got, 3 and 4 lanes of traffic on the interstate going both directions, if you can imagine putting that level of traffic and also transport, we have a lot of trucks moving goods around. So if you can imagine that going through our downtown, is probably not the best outcome. So I, for one, am really grateful that we ended up putting I-35 on the west side of town. But this was still, Austin Avenue was still really important to our community for a lot of reasons, not the least of which, this is a parade from 1940. Again, you can see the Palace Theater marquee on the right. You can see some other signs for Ford, for cafes, for Frigidaire, and for cleaners, tailors, hatters. So there was still a lot going on in 1940. And then you can see the community gathered for this parade and this marching band coming through town, which looks really fun. And so Piggly Wiggly, let's go back to that because this is kind of an important piece of the downtown puzzle when things started to change. Could you talk a little bit about what we're showing here?
So what we're showing here is an ad circa 1963 from the Sun for Piggly Wiggly. And one of its locations, I believe this one is prior to the one we saw earlier. So this is on the corner of 8th and Austin Avenue, if you can picture that building now. So there we go. There it is. That you might be a little more familiar with. It looks a little bit different, but downtown grocery stores were a staple. There were actually at different points in time 2 to 3 grocery stores downtown that would sometimes carry different supplies.
Wow.
And Piggly Wiggly became one of the most important downtown grocery stores.
I like that you could get things shortening for 59 cents.
Yes,
coffee for 59 cents. These are really good prices.
They're very good prices.
So this is, and again, if we go back to 1963, Georgetown population is about 5,300 people at this point. So we're still doing our shopping downtown. This is before I-35 came through with all of that projected growth that was expected to happen. And so we also see that our buildings have changed over time. But when I-35 did come through, it provided kind of a shift in how we did business and where businesses were located. And so if this looks kind of like a confusing blank to you and you're not really sure how to orient yourself, this intersection of I-35 and Highway 29 is where the first Georgetown HEB, as a lot of people know it, before, I remember before we had an HEB out on Williams Drive. Mm-hmm. And so this is where the HEB was. There was also a Walmart. That's where I went to go get my fishing license when I was younger. We wanted to go fishing for the summer. And so commercial development really started happening along I-35 once it got constructed and started to shift out of the downtown to great extent.
And it's also important to know.
Sorry, go ahead.
It really shifted to where there were those bridge crossovers and where there were exits. So that's where you see the development happening.
And so once traffic was rerouted out of downtown, so you were no longer being directed as a traveler straight through the middle of Georgetown, some businesses wanted to take opportunity of being close to those travelers. So similar to the storyline in the movie Cars, you might be familiar with, the highway moves and it kind of leaves the town behind, the town declines. It maybe wasn't quite so dramatic, but it did have impacts on our downtown when we started really being very oriented toward cars and roads and faster travel. We didn't want to take 4 days to get to Plainview if we didn't have to. We didn't want to take 2 days to get to Dallas. We can now get to Dallas, to San Antonio faster than we ever could before. And we didn't have to make all of these stops along the way. We could travel more smoothly. And so that's when we start to see commercial businesses really start to be oriented toward the highway. And in Georgetown's case, you know, it's good that the highway was not in downtown because it didn't disrupt those buildings. But the other side of that is business development really started to shift out of the downtown and into some of these more highway-oriented locations. And so here we have the same west side of the square. I'm glad to show everybody its evolution over time. So this is from 1970. This is just a couple of years after 35 was completed. And you're seeing these buildings are still in really great shape. Things look good. It is a black and white photo, so we can't see the color, but you can see signage for businesses. You can see at this point in time, the building on the far left, which is Gelman's, that's the Strongberg Hoffman building. They had done what we call slip covering. And so a slip cover is if you cover up the original building facade. Usually it was kind of a newer or sleeker look or appearance. By this point in time, the modernist movement, the international style in architecture had been really popular. People were looking at sleeker new buildings. And so some of our downtown buildings ended up getting these new facades to cover the original Victorian period facades because the business owners, the building owners were trying to be competitive with the development that was going on along the highway that was kind of a sleeker look and didn't have all of this decoration and ornamentation. And so for some buildings, we started to move away from that. We get the Macon-Some Hotel that ends up getting stuccoed, and the front of that really got changed over what it was. The Palace Theater, which was a brick facade, got stuccoed over. So we see by the 1970s, a lot of our building facades had changed and been covered up. And that maybe wasn't a change for the better the way that we would view it today, but at the time that was what was very fashionable and what people were doing. So this is, by the 1970s, this is the very beginnings of the historic preservation movement becoming kind of adopted as federal legislation. And it's right before the Main Street programs really got active, especially in Texas. And we were one of the first of those. And so here's the east side of the square. Austin Avenue was our main route of travel, but let's not forget Main Street. And so Main Street is where you can see there's a little more sign of decline with the buildings, the condition of the buildings, and also we're still seeing some business signage, but you can tell it wasn't quite as thriving as it was in the earlier photos that we were showing around the 1930s and before. And this is a color photo from 1970 that shows our square. And kind of put aside the color quality, it's not like sending a drone up today with a really high resolution camera. So we still see a lot of traffic. You see a ton of cars on the square. People were still conducting business here. Their businesses were still open. The courthouse was still where the county's business was being conducted. This is before the new facility got built over off of Rock Street or on 4th Street. So the courthouse is still the center of county business there. The city had their offices. We can see the library there at the very top.
At the very top corner, yes.
At the very top before it ended up locating a couple of times to get to its new home. And so, but this is where we were in the 70s, but by the 80s, you could see that things were really starting to show some wear. These buildings really needed love. And that was kind of an interesting time too in our downtown, because that started off a movement that is how we got the downtown that we love so much today. Not that we haven't always loved our downtown, not that it hasn't always been special, but something really special started to happen in the early 80s. And you can see this is Austin Avenue again, the west side of the square. We've got windows, upper windows boarded up, and we still have businesses. But if you go look at these building fronts today, this is a very different look and not quite as positive an impression to visitors as what we have today. And so this is the south side of the square. This is here at the corner of 8th and Main Streets. And you can see the buildings are still in just fine condition, but they maybe look a little bit tired and a little bit worn. Maybe some changes have been made over time to the fronts. We see a lot of stuccoing and a lot of replacement of the facade materials in a way that we have a lot of things in place to help protect against that today, because it's so important for us to retain this original fabric as much as possible. And so we had the Texas Main Street program. We were an early adopter to that. The Main Street program is still active in Georgetown today, thankfully. Super excited about that and the work that our Main Street board does. And so here are two buildings. We've got the before and then the after. So Gus's Pharmacy is on the east side of the square. You may know it today as the Georgetown Winery, but if you look for the building that says 1885 up at the top, this is one of the oldest remaining buildings on the square. It's a stone building, and you can see what it looked like before. And then after it got rehabbed, they repaired some features on the front. They uncovered those windows right above the canopy, new paint. It looked great then, and it still looks really good today. And then the Lockett building, which you may know today is Burger University. They're on the corner of 7th Street and Austin Avenue. This was a really surprising transformation. They brought back this beautiful corner window under that cupola. They put the windows back in great shape. At this time, they had some fabric awnings that aren't there now, so there have been even a few more changes, and the paint color scheme has changed a bit. But back in the early 80s, Main Street program was just a really strong, and the people who supported that were really strong proponents of, hey, you know, we've lost some of the business activity of our square, but we don't want to lose what's special about it. We want to take great care of these buildings so that we don't lose them. And so all of that hard work is what we're enjoying today as people continue to take great care of their buildings. And so with the Main Street program, and we give Linda McCalla so much credit for being such a strong leader during that time. Linda's graciously provided me with some photos of when the Main Street program was really starting its work. But you can see these streetscape improvements. We're getting better sidewalks, we're getting trees, benches, trash cans, things that we enjoy so much today, and the trees that have grown up and provide us some really wonderful and much needed shade during the summertime. And so if we go to the west side of the square again, you can see here are buildings today, beautifully painted, really well maintained. We've got really active businesses here. It's very hard to get a lease space downtown, even right now during the current pandemic. Because people are downtown is just so desirable, and people, when they talk about Georgetown, one of the things that they talk about liking the most is our downtown and our square. And we're just so thrilled that is something our community continues to embrace so warmly. So we have a special building. We're going to make a stop at a hotel. And Anne, if you could tell us a little bit about this building and a little bit about ice cream bucket. What was the ice cream bucket, and where does that come from?
So this is the Mickelson Steel building. So that's that hotel we've talked about several times that we've touched on as being part of the Palace, and then it extended over toward 8th Street. So this building is kind of special to me for a couple of reasons. One, it is really the first building that Main Street undertakes as a project and rehabs completely. So it's really our starting point for the way that the square looks now, and that entire kind of momentum going. And so it's a pretty special building for that. It's also special because it was owned by Emma Mickelson in the turn of the 20th century, so the early 1900s until 1924. She actually owned a grocery store there originally, and then she operated a hotel there, the Mickelson Hotel. What I love about that is we know a lot about Emma. We know absolutely nothing about her husband. So that's pretty
not usual.
That's not usual. But she operated the hotel there, which of course served as a hotel for people traveling up and down Highway 81 through town, but it also served because we were the county seat. So if anyone had to conduct county business, trials going on, that type of thing, that they were having to stay at the courthouse, she was the only hotel downtown.
Wow.
It was important. So it's important to remember her legacy, and it's so great to me that her building is the first one that's rehabbed. She was known for a couple of things. She was known for running the hotel where all sorts of different politics could be discussed. She was known for always keeping a supply of vegetable soup for anyone that might be hungry and needed it, whether they could pay for it or not.
Oh, that's great.
And she was known for, when she was a child, she actually witnessed Sam Bass riding away from the shootout that happened in Round Rock, because she lived in Round Rock as a young child. So she saw Sam Bass as he escaped, and was helped point the Texas Rangers towards him. And so she became this institution in Georgetown, but not through the ways that we typically think, through influence of politics or that type of thing. It became through her hotel, in the atmosphere that she cultivated there. So it's just fabulous to me that the Macomb Steel is the first thing to be rehabilitated. And you can see the ice cream bucket, which people might remember from the 80s and 90s, is one of the downtown ice cream stores. There were a couple growing up here, if you remember them throughout time. But actually, one of my favorite ghost stories comes from the ice cream bucket.
A ghost story.
A ghost
Tell me
story.
more.
Yes. So of course, I think the buildings have memory. And so there are all sorts of the normal ghost stories of chairs and things getting moved around in there, but there's also a story of a closet being nailed shut from the inside and people having to use a crowbar to pry it open. And that occurred when it was the ice cream bucket.
When it was the ice cream bucket.
When it was the ice cream bucket.
Not very long ago, we have an account of a closet in the business being nailed shut from the inside, and then they had to pry it open. That's really mysterious.
Very mysterious.
So we do have a few ghost stories downtown. Sometimes we get questions about those. So if y'all have questions about ghost stories, where ghosts are located, there's also a really excellent ghost tour downtown. That's done by the Williamson Museum. So if you have those questions, want to follow up on that, if you're interested in the ghost tour that when they're able to offer it, hopefully that's something that they'll be able to get back to before too long. Then please contact the Williamson Museum. They have some really wonderful information about that. And they're a great partner for our downtown. And so there's one more business that we don't have there today. People may or may not be familiar with this. I'm certainly familiar with it, and that's Gold's Department Store, which was a staple on our square for a very long time. So tell us a little bit about Gold's and about Mr. Gold.
So Harry Gold's father, I Gold, actually moved from New York to Texas with the pure goal of opening a clothing retail store, which he did in Bartlett originally in the early 1900s. And then by 1936, it had moved to the west side of the square. And then by about 1949, 1950 is when it located on 7th Street, which is where many people remember it because that's where it remained until the early 2000s. As you kind of mentioned, it's got that, it's not like we can see it now. It had a kind of that slipcover going on. It looked a little bit different. They had combined several buildings there on 7th Street. And there is still a bust of Harry Gold, though. One thing that I wanted to point out on the northwest corner. So when you walk by that bust, this is who it's honoring. This man who opened Gold's Department Store and operated it here, which was a thriving business all throughout the changes that occurred from the 50s, 60s, 70s onwards. He was a World War II veteran. He served on City Council, the Chamber of Commerce. He was active on the Library Council in the 70s too. So you got to throw out a shout out to him for that. So just to kind of be aware of, that's what some of these things around town are honoring, are those previous businesses and business owners who were here. So that's kind of my story about Gold's, although my favorite thing is if you click it, Robert Downey Jr. and Michael C. Hall once passed in front of it in the 1980s in a movie called Johnny Be Good. And that's all I remember about the movie, is that I can walk where Robert Downey Jr. walked.
How fun. So
But
this is a great shot because we had some side shots of golds, but this gives you kind of a more straight on look. So if you stand on the north side of the courthouse today, not just the courthouse square, but the actual courthouse lawn, if you stand on the north side, you can look at these buildings that used to be combined into Gold's department store. I remember shopping there when I was younger, getting shoes, getting my Easter dresses there. And then after Gold's department store closed, all of that covering and that brick was removed, and we revealed the original facades, or at least more close to the original facades along that center part of the north part of our square. And so feel free to go check that out, stand there and look at that and see if you can find Mr. Gold, say hi to him, and don't forget that we had some really kind of long-standing businesses in downtown, but also those played a large role in the community. So back to 1980, if y'all remember, in 1980, there were only about 9,500 people living in Georgetown, Texas. So we're still a fairly small town at that point, but big enough to make it on the film scene. So well done us. Well, thanks, Anne, so much for that information. This is always really fun. We are going to continue these first Tuesdays of the month at noon. We'll do it live, and then as soon as we're able to, we'll post the video so that you can watch it if you're not able to join us in person. We wanted to provide some contact information in case anyone needs to follow up. You can email historic@georgetown.org, or you can call us. My number is 512-930-3581. You can call Anne at 512-930-6614. And we also wanted to provide contact information for our Main Street program, which is still just the most wonderful support for our downtown and our downtown businesses today. They do a lot of really fantastic work. And especially right now, want to make sure that we're supporting our small businesses in Georgetown as much as we can. Feel free to contact the Main Street office if you have questions about how you can help with that, or just questions generally if you're looking to locate to our square. So Main Street at georgetown.org or 512-930-2027. You can also visit their website. It's mainstreet.georgetown.org. So very similar. So as we wrap up our comments, now I wanted to ask if we had any questions that we could answer. Has anybody asked any questions, or did we have anything come up while we were presenting?
Well, we have about 34 people that are watching through Zoom, and we have about another 18 watching on Facebook right now.
Oh, great. Thank y'all so much for joining us.
So don't see anybody has raised their hands just yet, but if there are any listeners on the Zoom call that would like to ask a question, I do see one hand being raised. I'm going to, Misty, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Great. Thanks for calling in. Do you have any questions for Britin or Ann?
Yeah, I would be interested. I've heard different stories about how when I-35 went over, they found the caves that were underneath, and we have an Interspace cavern. I wonder if they could tell us about that a little bit.
Absolutely.
Good question.
Yeah.
This is a great question.
So, like I said, it's on that Balcones escarpment. So by default, in that kind of landscape, you do get a lot of caverns where water has carved out large chunks of space. And when they were building I-35, they were actually drilling, and they kept losing drill bits. They just kept dropping down. And finally, they get a hole big enough that they decide to skin. You didn't want to be the skinniest guy, because that's who they decided to send down into the unknown, which turned out to be the great room of Interspace Cavern. So if you've ever been to Interspace Cavern, there is this enormous opening, grand room that's unlike many caves I've been in, that he actually ends up coming through in complete darkness with just a small little headlamp to try to figure out where he is. So they decide, some entrepreneurial businessmen decide that Georgetown's going to be a tourist spot. They're going to hit tourist gold with this interstate, and they're going to make this cave into a tourist attraction to pull people off of the interstate into Georgetown. Of course, it does get some traction. We still have it today. It's still a fantastic place to go. But didn't quite work to the same extent that they had hoped they would get tourists coming. But that is how Interspace became developed. It was purely meant to be a tourist attraction for I-35 once it was discovered. So,
Thank you.
yeah. It also has some fabulous names. If you've never gone on the tour there, you definitely should. The reason why it is called Interspace is because there was all of the space fever going on in the United States, and this is what they imagined the moon may look like in certain places. We didn't really fully know what to expect at different places in space. So yeah, it's a great tie into 35.
Checking in the Facebook world, don't see any people who have raised their hand in Facebook just yet. Great question. Misty, is there anybody else on the Zoom call who has a burning question for Ann or Britin?
One story I didn't get to share, I meant to share, was that all along 35, we didn't know the exact route that it was going to take. And we knew that it was going to come through Williamson County. And so the state demanded that counties start buying all of the right-of-ways in anticipation of this interstate being built. Our county judge, Sam Stone, refused to do that because he didn't know the exact path it was going to take. So he keeps refusing to do it for several years until 1956, when the federal government agreed to pay for 90% of the construction. And all counties between San Antonio and Dallas had already bought their right-of-ways except for Williamson County. And suddenly the state says, oh, wait, you don't have to, we'll pay for it. So Williamson County actually didn't pay for our right-of-ways for the interstate.
I can't tell if that's some really good foresight or just
it could
really
go
lucky.
either way.
But what a great outcome for Williamson County not having to pay for that. So thank you all again so much for joining us. We're going to wrap up, but we will be back next month, the first Tuesday at noon. If you have questions, please feel free to contact us. Email is probably the best way if that works for you. So historic@georgetown.org is a great way to reach us if you have questions. And then as soon as we have the meeting set up and the topic ready to post, that'll be on historic.georgetown.org. And so you can always check back to that main webpage for historic, which is what I get to do every day. And you can check back at that page and see the latest updates, and also a link to when we're able to get that video posted. Usually takes us a couple of days to get that done, so please be patient, but we should have it up hopefully by next week. So everybody have a great rest of your Tuesday. We really appreciate you joining, whether that was on the Zoom meeting or from Facebook. And please continue to support our local businesses during this time. Please stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thanks so much.